Well, I have top of the hour. So if that means 3 o'clock on Eastern time and 2 o'clock on Central time. So we'll get started with our Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Paul Gross, an extension educator of Central Michigan, along with Christina Correll, also from the Central in Michigan, and Anne Marie Nardi from Wisconsin, who's going to be working behind the scenes today. So for those who have not joined the Nexus in the past, just to say who we are, a little bit about us. The Soil Health Nexus has been around for several years, and we're a university-led team, are dedicated to increasing our knowledge, research, and education and resources for soil health education. We're part of the North Central Region Water Network that includes the 12 land-grant universities across the North Central region. So the format today is we're going to have our presenter will talk for 20 or 25 minutes, followed by a short Q&A period. Then we'll have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms to discuss the topic. You have an opportunity to go into several breakout rooms that are listed. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce Etienne Herrick. She's a PhD candidate student at the Blesh Soil and Agroecosystems Lab at the University of Michigan. So I'm going to stop sharing and welcome, and please maybe give us a little more background about yourself, and the floor is yours to talk about your topic today. So welcome.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction, Paul. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen here. Are you seeing my slide?
Not yet.
Oh. There we go.
There we go.
Now? Yep. Okay. All right. So let's see, by way of introduction, I'm a PhD candidate in Dr. Jennifer Blesh's Soil and Agroecosystems Lab, like Paul mentioned, at the University of Michigan. So I study ecologically based strategies for improving the sustainability and resilience of agricultural ecosystems. And today I'll be presenting on an ongoing project where we're using citizen science to better understand cover crop performance across the Great Lakes region. This work is funded by U of M's program in public scholarship, a USDA NIFA grant, and has also been conducted in part through a collaboration with Michigan Agriculture Advancement. All right, so although this talk doesn't focus specifically on soil health, it does focus on a practice that we all know has huge potential for improving soil health across a wide range of farming systems. And one of the keys to building soil health with cover crops, along with all of the other wonderful benefits they offer, is making sure that they accumulate enough biomass or growth. So in general, the more cover crop biomass you have, the larger the magnitude of benefits they'll provide. For example, we can see here that ecosystem services like nitrogen retention, weed suppression, and nitrogen supply from legumes all increase with cover crop biomass across farms. And this is one of the reasons it's particularly helpful to grow overwintering cover crops, which tend to accumulate more biomass, have higher levels of nutrient supply and retention, and extend the portion of the year with living plant cover compared to those that winter kill. However, one of the things I've learned from working with farmers over the past several years is that overwintering cover crop growth can be highly variable, often even more so than what's shown on these three graphs. Take these two photos, for instance, which both show cereal rye cover crops from an on-farm experiment in spring of 2021. The fields were planted the same way in the same county at the same time, but still had really different growth outcomes when we sampled them in the spring. And this is likely because there are a lot of different factors that can influence plant growth, like soil properties, climate, and management practices, which means that no two fields are ever exactly the same. So the goal of this study is to figure out how and why cover crop outcomes vary across farms in the Great Lakes region so that we can begin to identify what works well and what doesn't across different farming conditions, and in turn, help farmers maximize benefits from their cover crops. To do this, we're partnering with farmers across the Great Lakes region to gather data on cover crop growth and key factors that can influence cover crop outcomes on real farms. By partnering with farmers to collect this information, we're able to expand the scope of the study to include far more locations and types of farms than would otherwise be possible using typical research approaches. In turn, the data that farmer partners report will help inform context-specific recommendations for cover crop management across the region. And the more farmers who participate, the better those recommendations will be. Our citizen science approach involves two main components: a farm and management survey and a field assessment. The Farm and Management Survey asks questions about different factors that could influence cover crop growth, like planting strategy, seeding rate, soil type, and management history. And then the field assessment is what allows us to actually quantify cover crop growth across lots of different fields. So during our first season of data collection this past spring, we asked all participants to visit their cover crop field to collect data on two main things: canopy cover photos and height measurements. So for the canopy cover photos, participants collected photos like the one you see here that captured the cover crop canopy at 3 different locations in the field. And then at each location, they also collected several plant height measurements. We're then able to take the canopy cover photos and run them through a program called Foliage, which calculates the percent ground cover in each photo. So for instance, the photo here has a percent cover of 68.4. We then take the percent cover number and multiply it by the average plant height in that field to get an estimate of cover crop biomass. And now getting into the weeds here a little bit with the field assessment, both literally and figuratively, we also had some supplemental questions and steps in the field assessment to help make sure that we could get a really accurate estimate of cover crop biomass in each of those fields. So to account for weeds in the cover crop biomass estimates, we had each participant rate the weed pressure in their field on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being really low and 5 being really high weed pressure. And then we used those rankings to correct the cover crop biomass estimates. And then for cover crop mixtures, we had participants collect height measurements for each species, or just the 4 most dominant species if the mixture contained more than 4. And then we also asked that they estimate the relative proportion of each species so that we could calculate an abundance-weighted cover crop biomass estimate for mixtures. And then finally, to ensure data quality and consistency, we had participants view a demonstration video before performing the field assessment that included things like examples of different levels of weed pressure, like what's shown here on the right. And we also made sure to keep the protocol as clear and concise as possible. On average, it took participants about 20 to 30 minutes to complete the field assessment. Our field assessment protocol builds on established methods for estimating plant biomass commonly used by extension agents and other researchers. But to determine exactly how accurate our protocol was, we also collected validation data. So this involved visiting a subset of the participating fields to destructively sample cover crop biomass at the same time the field assessment data were being collected this past spring. Since I had the field assessment data and actual biomass data from a subset of farms, I was able to create this graph on the right showing that percent cover times height on the x-axis is a strong predictor of actual cover crop biomass on the y-axis. This relationship between percent cover times height and actual biomass is described numerically by the equation in the upper left corner of the graph. So for all the rest of the fields where we we're not able to actually collect real biomass samples, we're able to plug in the percent cover times height number from the field assessment, plug it into this equation, and get an estimate of cover crop biomass without actually having to visit all of those fields and collect samples. All right, so we just wrapped up our first season of data collection this past spring, and I'm excited to share some preliminary results with all of you. We were able to gather cover crop data from 129 cover crop fields, including 61 in Michigan, 12 in Ohio, 9 in Indiana, 5 in Illinois, 34 in Wisconsin, and 8 in Minnesota. 62 of the fields were single species cover crops, shown as the red points on the map, and 65 were mixtures, shown as the blue points. And part of the reason we have a much higher field count in Michigan is because these data do include a number of fields from a complementary on-farm experiment that we're conducting on farms in Michigan, where we're collecting much more detailed information about cover crop traits and ecosystem services, including looking at below ground biomass. So I'd be happy to chat a bit more about that later if anyone is interested. In terms of the types of cover crops we saw growing, for single species fields, we had 50 fields of cereal rye, so by far the most common cover crop in the study. We had 5 fields of winter wheat, 3 of triticale, and 9 crimson clover. And for mixtures, we found that the average number of species was 4, and the most popular species included things like cereal rye, hairy vetch, winter peas, rapeseed, and we also saw 6 different species of clover. And then the 2 metrics at the bottom, average weed pressure and average percent cover, come from the field assessment data. So when we compare between mixtures and single species cover crops, they actually had pretty similar weed pressure scores. So 1.56 for mixtures and 1.67 for single species covers, which tells us that in general, farmers were getting pretty good weed control with their cover crops this past spring. And then for percent cover, mixtures actually provided slightly higher average percent cover at 32%, while single species cover crops provided an average of 27% cover. However, both of these numbers are relatively low because we had quite a few fields with poorly performing cover crops this past spring due to the really cold and wet weather. And then just a few other fun facts related to mixtures in this study. The highest diversity mixture contained 14 different species. 82% of the mixtures contained both a grass and a legume. And then 68% of mixtures contained a grass, legume, and brassica species. So really exciting to see farmers experimenting with functionally diverse species in their cover crop mixtures. And here we have graphs showing cover crop biomass for each of the different fields in the study, with single species fields on the left and mixtures on the right. So in terms of big picture, looking at these 2 graphs, we see that cover crop biomass did vary really widely across fields this past spring for both single species and mixture fields. However, when we compare the 2 graphs against each other, we see that the single species cover crops actually showed much larger variation than the mixtures, from a minimum of 0.53 pounds per acre all the way up to a max of 7,248 pounds per acre, whereas the mixtures had a minimum of 42 pounds per acre and a max of only 4,365 pounds per acre. But what's particularly interesting here is that despite the maximum biomass value being quite a bit higher for the single species covers than for the mixtures still come out on top when we look at average cover crop biomass, which was 983 pounds per acre for the mixtures compared to the single species average at 892. But considering how much variation we do see across all of these fields, this begs the question, what is driving all of this variation? This slide shows several relationships specifically for cereal rye fields in the study, with rye biomass on the y-axis, regressed against variables that we would expect to impact cover crop growth on the x-axis, like growing degree days, precipitation, and seeding rate. And while these relationships do explain some of the variation in rye biomass across fields, there's still a lot left unexplained. And this is where other factors from the Farm and Management Survey come into play, like soil type, preceding crop, planting strategy, management history, etc. So our goal is to build more integrative models that take into account all of these factors and help us figure out which ones are most important for determining cover crop outcomes. We then hope to use that information to provide farmers with recommendations for how to adapt or optimize their cover crop management based on their specific conditions. And what's key here, again, is that the more data we have, the better these models will be. Unfortunately, we don't have these models ready quite yet for the first year of the study, but the next few slides will give you a sneak peek as to what some of those other variables from the Farm and Management Survey look like so far. We had a range of soil types included in the study, with the most common being clay loam, followed by loam, sandy loam, and clay. And when we asked participants how many months on average they maintained living soil cover, over a third reported having living soil cover for nearly the entire year. Just under half maintained soil cover for 8 to 10 months out of the year, and roughly a fifth of participants had living soil cover for only 5 to 7 months out of the year. In terms of farm type, 93% of the fields in this study were used for row crops, while the remaining 7% were a mix of vegetable fields and other miscellaneous farm types. And somewhat surprisingly, 52% of the fields in the study were no-till, 41% were reduced tillage, and only 7% used conventional tillage, which is certainly not representative of national trends. I think the fact that we see the majority of participants minimizing soil disturbance and maintaining soil cover for a significant portion of the year indicates that our sample might be somewhat biased towards individuals who are familiar with and committed to using sustainable practices, and are probably also people who are excited about contributing to and learning from cover crop research. These two figures show the percent of participants who used each of these different inputs for the preceding cash crop on the left, and then during the cover crop growing season on the right. So as expected, the most common input for the preceding crop was nitrogen fertilizer, but we also had about 25% of participants report that they applied no inputs to their cash crop. I will note that other than the no input category, these columns are actually not mutually exclusive. So for instance, there were a number of folks who applied both nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer to their preceding crop. And then for the cover crops, most people just let them be, didn't apply any inputs, just let them grow, although some folks did apply manure. When we asked participants how they felt about the performance of their cover crop this past year, 59% were satisfied or very satisfied with their cover crop, but that also means that 41% were less than satisfied, which tells us that there's still quite a bit of room for improvement, and hopefully this type of research can help with that. And then when it comes to experience, most participants in the study had been using cover crops on their field for between 2 to 10 years, but 17% were actually using cover crops for the first time in that particular field, and only 2% had been using them for over 20 years. And while it might be tempting to assume that farmers with more experience are more likely to be satisfied with their cover crop because they've been able to hone in on their management over time, we actually found that there is no significant relationship between cover crop satisfaction and number of years using cover crops, at least for this first year of the study. This could potentially change if in coming years we're able to recruit a more diverse set of participants, since this past year was somewhat skewed towards those in the 2 to 5 and 6 to 10 years of experience range. And lastly, I thought I'd share a word cloud of all of the responses we got when we asked each participant what their biggest management challenge was for their field. So not specific to cover crop management necessarily, but just general management overall. And as you can see, the most frequently reported problem was weeds, followed by a number of different issues related to water, like water infiltration and retention, drainage, and receiving too little or too much rainfall throughout the growing season. Erosion and compaction also popped up a number of times, as did things like soil health, fertility, and nutrients. So although it's a bit of a daunting list of challenges, what's exciting about this is that all of these folks who reported these problems have already figured out that cover crops can be a major part of the solution. And by participating in this project, they're telling us that they're invested in figuring out how to make cover crops work for their systems. I think the more farmers and researchers who are willing to participate in this type of collaborative work, centered around learning with and from each other, the more likely we are to find solutions that benefit everyone. And finally, I'll finish up here with a quick plug for our upcoming season of data collection. So we're currently recruiting farmers for next spring. So anyone who will have an overwintering cover crop growing in spring of 2023 is welcome to participate. We're offering $50 per field for up to 2 fields, along with a personalized cover crop performance report that incorporates findings from the study. I do realize that many of you on this call may not have your own cover crops to include in the study, but we would be really grateful if you could pass on the word to your networks. There's a QR code here that'll take you to a sign-up survey if you would like to participate, and you can find more information on the Blesh Lab website, or feel free to send me an email. The last thing I'll mention is that this year we are particularly interested in connecting with field technicians, crop advisors, and other folks who actually have their boots on the ground to see if we could potentially offer some help to farmers for completing the field assessment in the spring, since we know that's a really busy time of year for them. So if this is something you're interested in or that you could help with, please shoot me an email. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. We'll leave your recruiting slide up for the time being. There's a number of questions in the chat, and I don't know if you want me to read them off or if you want to just kind of go down through them.
Yeah, I can just go through them. Let's see. So I see a question about foliage, followed by a comment about Canopio. Yeah, so foliage is basically the same program as Canopio, except it's for batch processing. So since I had so many photos to process, you can just sort of upload them all at once. But it basically gives you the same output as Canopio would. Canopio is just sort of like the mobile phone version. So yeah, I would highly recommend that if you're interested in sort of, keeping track of percent cover for your own fields.
Are they free? Or are they
Yep,
a
totally
fee?
free.
Thank you.
Let's see. So what seemed to be the main factor from your farmers on why they were dissatisfied by their cover crops? That is an excellent question. And actually, it's not something that I had included in the initial survey. So for this past year, I'm not sure that I could really say what the main factor was, but it's certainly something we could consider including this coming year in the survey to get a better idea of, what makes a good cover crop versus a bad one. I would say just from conversations with folks this past spring, I think many of them were dissatisfied just because they were not able to plant the cover crops quite as early as they would have liked to. I know, especially in Ohio, they had a lot of fall rain, and so they weren't able to get out into the fields. And so they just ended up with lower biomass than they would have liked. Let's see. And then another comment, the word cloud did not mention lower yield as a management challenge. It was actually in there. It only popped up maybe once or twice. So it was surprising that it wasn't in there as often. And then, yes, I can certainly send an email out with this information. Paul, is there a listserv?
Yes, there is. Christina will take care of that to get that information out to the participants today.
That'd be fantastic.
Yes, and I also did put a link to your website on there.
Oh, good. Thank you.
With the link that you can sign up if you are for the recruitment. And that also has your email on there. So I think that can be a great link for folks.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Another question. Is there data on whether desiccants are used between cash crop and cover crop planting? I unfortunately don't have that information, but it is something we could think about including this coming year. Certainly an interesting thought. I don't know if anyone else has comments or thoughts on that. You're welcome to chime in. See another comment here about the importance of ecology under the ground through the plant/microbe interaction using mixes. Could explain more biomass. Yeah, that's a really exciting area of research, looking at how different species interact with microbes in the soil, and certainly with more diverse cover crop mixtures, we're seeing more I guess, greater levels of microbial diversity as well as microbial activity. So that's a really great way to improve soil health, and is often, I think there's a lot of research pointing to it potentially being slightly more effective than just single species in terms of promoting that microbial community in your soil.
Is anyone in your lab working on that, measuring those microbial communities?
Yeah, we have a couple of folks in the lab right now. One of them is a postdoc, Kent Connell. He's looking at how mixtures of cereal rye and I believe crimson clover influence microbial activity in the soil, and then also looking at different pools of organic matter and how those are influenced as well by mixtures compared to the single species cover crops. And then we also have someone in the lab looking at below ground root traits and how those also interact with the microbial communities. So I think also at Penn State, there's a lot of really great work being done on that as well. Let's see. Another comment, you mentioned approximately 50% of the surveyed farms are already using conservation or no-till tillage, which is in contrast with most farms who have not made that transition. So will your recommendations reflect the farms not using conservation tillage? Really great point there. Certainly something important to consider. So when we think about how generalizable these models will be, we'll definitely have to take into account what our sample actually looks like. So if we don't end up with a larger sample of fields that are under conventional tillage, it's definitely more difficult to say that we can take these results and apply them to those types of fields. So that's one reason we're doing a second year of the study. We would love to sort of diversify our participant pool to get a more even representation of those different types of farming systems. And then I see another comment, would recommend a focus on cultivars in addition to species. Yeah, I would love to do that at some point in the future. There are certainly a lot of nuances there, and you can look at variation just within different varieties of hairy vetch and see big differences. Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's see. Another question, how many of your farmers had mentors, coaches, or crop advisors? That is a great question, and I don't have an answer to that. I do know just from chatting with a lot of the folks who participated that they're really active in sort of agricultural networks. So a lot of them actually ended up knowing each other, within a given state. And then, yeah, I know many of them were in touch with extension or various like watershed conservation groups. So that certainly played a role, but I didn't end up asking specifically if they had mentors or coaches and that type of information.
One question I have is the data that you're collecting, and will it be useful in, carbon sequestration as far as the new programs that are out for paying farmers to sequester carbon. How will this data be useful for them or for industry?
Ooh, that's a tricky question.
It wasn't meant to
My-
be tricky, but all the discussion now is carbon credits and those types of things. And it just looks to me like there might be some interesting data that comes out of this that could be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's certainly a step in the right direction because a lot of those programs are just sort of taking a binary approach where they say, are you growing a cover crop or are you not growing a cover crop? And then sort of base their evaluation on that. So taking a look at the data from a more continuous approach where we recognize that cover crop biomass does vary across fields and that then has implications for how much carbon you're inputting into your soil. So certainly from that perspective, I think it does have potential. I'm just sort of hesitant with the whole carbon market situation because there's so much that we still don't quite understand about carbon sequestration in the soil. Like soil is super fascinating, is really complicated. So we certainly know that things like cover cropping and minimizing disturbance are good for sequestering carbon, but there's a lot of nuance in there that we still don't quite have a handle on. So yeah, certainly more science needs to be done to inform those markets, I think. But yes, that's a good question.
I have another question in the box for you.
So is there a final report somewhere that we can share with folks who aren't here perchance? Yeah, that's a great question. So I do have sort of a quick and dirty handout put together that I would be happy to send around. I'm still sort of working on compiling some more thorough results from this first year of the study, and we'll have like a more solid final report in the coming months. So I'd also be happy to share that as well once it's ready. But yeah, in the meantime, I do have a handout that I could send around. And then, yeah, this comment, hard to do with only 5 responses from Illinois. Any plans to develop state-specific summaries? Could be interesting to compare adoption between states and also to have more state-specific scope for those of us doing state-specific work. Yeah, excellent point. Given that we have much larger sample sizes for Michigan and Wisconsin specifically, we will have much more robust models for those 2 areas because we simply have more data points. We would love to increase our numbers for those other states like Illinois, Indiana, potentially Minnesota too, so that we can build robust models for those areas as well. But I think it would make a lot of sense if, say, we end up with a lot of farms specifically from Michigan to develop some materials and content specifically catered to cover cropping in Michigan. See another question. Given the within state variability, it might be more useful to base recommendations on soil type and climate zone. Yeah, so that's certainly something we'll be incorporating into the models. So the models, to start, they will not necessarily be state-based, but they will be based on basically different categories of farms. So farms with similar climate and soil properties and management histories and things like that. So that's how we'll be sort of characterizing the results. And then we can go from there and think about if it might make sense to sort of branch out and do something specific for Michigan or Wisconsin or things along those lines. Another good comment, considering cropping rotation, so dairy versus cash grain. We do have that information. I haven't quite been able to delve into that in detail yet, but certainly something we'll take into consideration.
I think that was the last one.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind asking the question myself a little bit, if maybe you could expand a little bit on some of the other study when you were talking about below ground biomass and how that, before we go into breakout sessions, it just piqued my interest, and
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked because I actually have a slide here for it.
I,
Just in case. Um, So yeah, this slide is just sort of a quick look at some of our preliminary results from that study. So we spent a lot of time digging up cover crop roots and washing and cleaning them and measuring biomass, nitrogen, and carbon in all of those roots. So the overall message in this slide, without going into too much detail, is that our mixture definitely provided higher levels of all three of those things. So more biomass, more nitrogen, and more carbon than either of the single species treatments, which were cereal rye and crimson clover. And a lot of this was due to the coarse roots we planted dwarf Essex rapeseed. So the coarse roots made a huge contribution to things like nitrogen and carbon, and really just highlights sort of the benefits of functional complementarity. So combining a grass, legume, and a brassica in your mixture. Yeah, so that's just sort of a quick overview of some of the things we found there. We also looked at things like the root to shoot ratio and the carbon to nitrogen ratio across those different treatments. So yeah, I'm happy to share more about that if anyone's interested, but big picture message is mixtures are really beneficial for a lot of reasons.
yeah, that's good information. There's a couple more questions, comments in the chat you can look at before we break.
All right, so how long will this data collection continue? So currently we are just planning to do one more year of data collection. So for this spring of 2023, I think one of my research dreams would be to get enough funding to sort of continue this type of work long term, even potentially expanding it to look at things beyond just biomass. I think this type of approach has a lot of potential for helping us advance understanding of cover crops, as well as other practices more broadly. But yeah, for right now, just one more year. And then I see another comment, biology under the ground is going to be the key to sustainable food production and watershed ecosystem services. Yeah, lots of really exciting stuff going on in the soil. And I'm really excited to see more people appreciating all of the complex interactions and processes that go on there.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for presenting today and sharing some of your knowledge and information and answering the questions. We really appreciate that. We're anxious to get some of the follow-up information as we go forward. I'd like to thank you again and invite everyone to go into breakout rooms. But before we do, I'd like to invite folks to join us for the November 16th Digital Cafe, which the topic is still to be determined. Thank you for joining us today. Please get into a breakout room and have a discussion on the topic that we heard today. So with that, thank you very much and have a good day, everyone.